Thank you to the panelists for that robust discussion on how the transportation industry is working to lower global emissions. Once again, I'm Sean Affelter, Vice President of Government Relations at Crest Forum. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce another great bipartisan lineup of members to share their clean energy priorities in Congress.
Hello, I'm Congressman Scott Peters from San Diego, California, and I'm so glad to be here with you virtually for National Clean Energy Week and your Policymakers Symposium. Our country prides itself on accomplishing big things, whether it's winning world wars, constructing an interstate highway system, or discovering the next medical breakthrough. Our greatest challenge this century will be combating the climate crisis. We've mobilized quickly before. During World War II, San Diego war factories built a bomber an hour, and today we're debating whether a decade is the appropriate amount of time to construct a single high voltage transmission line, a single offshore wind facility, or a geothermal plant. Last Congress, we provided record funding to build a cleaner and more secure energy system through historic legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. This Congress, we need to work on speed because we can have all the money in the world and we will still fail if we don't act faster. This isn't a problem we can solve on our own, which is why I'm so thankful for your efforts and participation in this conversation. As you know, there's a lot of work to be done. The stakes are incredibly high. According to research from Princeton University, 80% of the projected emissions reductions from the Inflation Reduction Act depend on building transmission faster, 80%. So to hit our climate goals, we need to build 200,000 miles of new high voltage transmission lines by the 2030s. And over the last decade, we've only just built 1,800 miles a year because each one takes more than 10 years to complete. And it's not just transmission that's delayed. According to a new report from Boston Consulting Group, permitting timelines have doubled since the 1970s. And nearly half of all clean energy projects are delayed by the permitting process compared to just 15% of fossil fuel projects. Look, in the 1970s, our environmental priority was to stop dirty projects. We were on the defense. But now if we want to cut our emissions in time and build the green infrastructure of the future, our country needs to go on the offense. We have NEPA to thank for a great deal of environmental preservation, but its implementation is inevitably slow, with documents that are thousands of pages long and reviews that take more than 4 years to complete. That was a law responding to the challenges of its time. But it didn't come from Moses on stone tablets. It was written by people no smarter than anyone in this room. So we can and we should update it for the challenges of today. We can update our laws to protect our communities by requiring more opportunities for early and meaningful community engagement, which is the right thing to do and leads to better project outcomes. So despite long odds and a small step forward in the debt ceiling deal, we're not done advancing comprehensive bipartisan permitting reform this Congress. Just last week, I introduced a new bill with Senator Hickenlooper, the Big Wires Act. And that proposal would simply require regions be able to transfer a minimum amount of power among each other. This will make our grid more resilient to extreme weather, it'll lower costs for consumers, and will help us build out the transmission lines we need to carry clean and affordable energy from where it's produced to where it's needed by people and businesses. I'm also continuing my work with my colleagues in both parties to push forward a comprehensive permitting reform package that will help us meet our climate goals, improve community input, and fix the broken judicial process. But we will need all of your help and input to build support for these proposals and get them across the finish line. Thank you for your leadership, your service, and your passion. Each of you will play a key role in helping us pass bold, bipartisan permitting reform by the end of the year to unlock the clean energy revolution we desperately need. Thanks again for having me. Thanks for your work. And I wish all of you the best with the rest of the conference.
Hi, I'm Jeff Duncan. I'm from South Carolina's 3rd Congressional District, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in National Clean Energy Week. You know, here in Congress, we're celebrating the legislation and technology that cleanly powers our world. I'm chairman of the Energy Subcommittee on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and our priority is to deliver affordable, reliable, and clean energy to all Americans. We're working hard here in Congress to strengthen and expand energy infrastructure. We have an abundance of natural resources in this country. We've got to take advantage of cleaner burning U.S. produced natural gas, delivering that gas to where it can be utilized by our utilities to provide baseload power, and also export that to folks around the world to lessen their carbon footprint, their carbon emissions, and improve their quality of lives. We need to do this through pipeline permitting reform and expedite the build out of pipeline infrastructure in this country. We also need to look at and working on advancing nuclear power in the nation. That comes in the form of traditional light water reactors as well as small modular reactors and advanced nuclear technology, while also understanding that we need a domestic supply source for enriched uranium and lessen our dependence on Russian sources of enriched uranium. We also need to prevent the offlining of power generation, particularly dispatchable generation. As coal-fired power plants are taken out of the energy mix, we need to replace that with dispatchable energy provided by clean-burning U.S.-produced natural gas and not be wholly reliant on this rush to green initiative of renewable generation of wind and solar. They have their place, but we also have to have that always on, always ready dispatchable energy. Simply look at Germany. They tried to replace their nuclear power generation with renewables. The renewables in the north, the manufacturing's in the south, and what resulted was Germany cranking back up the coal-fired power generation and being sort of hypocritical to some of their climate initiatives of the past. China's been building out wind and solar, but building out wind and solar primarily components for U.S. Renewables. They're doing so with more coal-fired power plants, building new coal-fired generation about every 30 days. We need to export our resources here at home to achieve energy dominance. H.R. 1130, Unlocking Our Domestic LNG Potential Act, actually helps expedite export of clean-burning American-produced natural gas to aid our allies in Europe and friends and allies around the world meet their energy needs. It's a free market approach to LNG exports. U.S. should be a global leader in energy production, and primarily we should be a global leader in nuclear power technology. This requires a predictable and efficient licensing and regulation. We've had meetings with the NRC to try to bring the NRC into the 21st century to help meet the goals of propagating nuclear power in this country. This could come in the form of small modular reactors. It could come in the form of other advanced type reactors. One thing I like about small modular reactors, they're small, they're modular, they're manufactured, and they can help spread the cost out over the economies of scale and lower the cost of nuclear production in this nation. Recently, I held a legislative hearing on securing America's nuclear energy future. There is bipartisan work here in Congress to expand American nuclear technology, to modernize the NRC, and to propagate advanced nuclear in this nation. Modernize the NRC for more efficient licensing, especially for advanced reactor technology. Nuclear energy is reliable, it's safe, and it's clean. It makes up about half of the nation's clean energy every year. It provides 20% of our nation's power, generates in my state of South Carolina somewhere between 54 and 58% of our baseload generation. And it creates 90% of South Carolina's carbon-free electricity. So thanks again for allowing me to participate in National Clean Energy Week. We look forward to working in the United States Congress as chair of the House Energy Subcommittee on the full Energy and Commerce Committee. We're dedicated to make sure that America has affordable, reliable, and clean energy well into the future.
Hi, I'm Richard Campbell, Vice President of Policy and Research at Congressional. As you've heard throughout the symposium, burdensome permitting processes pose an extraordinary challenge for clean energy development. Our next panel will highlight industry perspectives and how permitting reform can advance American clean energy production. I'm pleased to introduce the moderator of this panel, my colleague Christine Harbin, Crestforum's Vice President of External Affairs. Welcome, Christine.
Good afternoon. Wonderful to see everyone. Thank you for joining us for National Clean Energy Week. We have an exciting series of policy programming and in-person networking events this week, and we greatly appreciate your partnership. I'm Chrissy Harbin, and I handle external affairs and engagements for Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions Forum. I am delighted to moderate this panel discussion featuring industry perspectives on the need for permitting reform. This is a timely topic, and we've heard bipartisan calls for permitting reform throughout our policy symposium. Yesterday, Todd Snitchler, CEO of EPSA, referred to the status quo as banana. Build absolutely nothing, anytime, anywhere. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Thankfully, we're seeing a lot of action in Congress. The U.S. House of Representatives passed meaningful permitting reform twice now. First, through H.R. 1, the Lower Energy Costs Act, and through its initial debt ceiling package. Some of these reforms were included in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which became law in June, such as limiting timelines of judicial reviews and streamlining. But there's more that needs to be done, and we're going to talk about it today. This discussion will feature the growing consensus across the energy industry on the need to reform our myriad permitting laws. And I'm delighted to have 5 industry leaders join us. Each will bring significant insight to our discussion. I'm delighted to introduce Jason Gourmet, CEO of the American Clean Power Association, Ann Bradbury, CEO of the American Exploration and Production Council, Brian Wolf, Chief Strategy Officer and Executive Vice President of Public Policy and External Affairs at Edison Institute, and Dr. Jennifer Ewell, Vice President of Technical and Regulatory Services at the Nuclear Energy Institute. Last but not least, we have Malcolm Wolf, President and CEO of the National Hydropower Association. But before we dive into the discussion, I also want to thank our audience for joining us. My hope is that this panel discussion will provide some excellent industry insights for these important policy challenges that we're facing today. I'm going to hand the mic over to each of our panelists for some introductory remarks, and then we'll engage in a robust dialogue about the challenges and opportunities they face. I'll turn it first to Jason Gourmet for some initial thoughts, and then we'll turn things over to Ann, Brian, Jennifer, and then Malcolm. Jason?
Well, thank you, Chrissy, and thanks to Heather and the whole CREST team for putting together what's a pretty remarkably substantive, solution-oriented set of discussions this week. Great to be here with my buddies, and I actually feel kind of fortunate that I'm going first because I think the challenge for this panel is probably going to be all the ways in which we're agreeing and finding some kind of constructive tension to really dig into. Because, look, the good news is this issue is in a much better place than it's been for the last 20 years. We have made, I think, real progress, and now I think there's an opportunity before the Congress to come up with a pretty comprehensive, meaty piece of legislation that would actually have a coherent view of federalism, that would address, the full suite, as Congressman Duncan discussed, of technology, and that would be moving us meaningfully towards a clean and secure future. So that's the good news. The bad news is nobody's asking us to do it, and I will come back to that in a moment. But this is definitely an opportunity that is not being seized in the current political moment. So look, the question fundamentally is, are we trying to achieve our climate and security goals in theory or in practice? We have a unique opportunity. We have a significant congressional commitment to an energy strategy that is kind of fundamentally anchored in innovation and investment, not in regulation and taxation. And this is, despite how unfortunately partisan the kind of position was that passed the legislation, this is a fundamentally broad-based set of ideas that I think can animate a long-term future. We're moving fast, but not nearly fast enough. And I will not go through the litany of all of the ways in which our current process is inadequate to the task. But it's fair to say that our innovation in technology is not being matched by innovation in national, federal, and state decision-making. So just to kind of, foreshadow what at least we at ACP believe is the politics of the possible, we think there's a piece of legislation out there that has 4 basic components. One is a meaningful increase, particularly in the kind of interregional transmission that Congressman Peters talked about, coupled with meaningful efforts to address the kind of inefficiency and unpredictability of state permitting of pipelines under the Clean Water Act, add in a little bit of judicial review, and round it out with some support for the mining and processing of critical minerals. Those are the 4 corners we think of a real piece of legislation. But again, the problem is that we've got talented evangelists out there. You heard from a couple of them today, but nobody feels like they have actually the authority or the purchase to bring the world together and demand some action. So what we think we need is a good old-fashioned congressional gang. That's been the way that we've actually made significant progress in a bipartisan way on things like infrastructure recently, also with CHIPS Act and others. For gangs to work, they have to, have a couple of key elements. They've got to be actually endorsed and authorized by leadership. They don't go anywhere if they're rogue. They have to have real representation from the key committees of jurisdiction. And finally, they have to have some kind of timeline that they're working under. If that, comes together, I think there is a non-trivial opportunity to put real legislation on the table. And I will just close with my favorite reflection from one of my favorite musicians, Howlin' Wolf, who has a wonderful song called "I'm Built for Comfort, Baby. I Ain't Built for Speed." That is unfortunately an apt description of how we're approaching the clean energy transition. And we think that we've got to not just tolerate, but embrace a little bit of discomfort if we actually want to get from here to where we want to be. So with that, Chrissy, I will toss it back to you and look forward to some conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. That's really helpful. I'd like to turn things over to Ann next to speak to, from her perspective in the oil and gas community, about this important topic.
Thanks, Chrissy. And one thing I've learned over time is that you never want to follow Jason. And I'm sorry that I have no musical illusions for you. But hopefully, you can stay with me nonetheless. So huge thanks to Chrissy and the CREST team for hosting this really important discussion on the need to modernize our permitting system to produce ever cleaner energy here in America. And it's great that this panel consists of all different forms of American energy. I represent the oil and gas industry. We represent the leading independent producers of oil and gas, but we certainly fundamentally believe in an all of the above energy system that includes all of my colleagues here on the call today. Oil and natural gas, we know, are going to play a foundational role in both our domestic and global energy mix for decades to come. And permitting reform is the key to ensuring that we are able to do so in an ever cleaner and more sustainable way. So whether it's continuing to build out sufficient pipeline infrastructure to reduce the need for flaring, or ensuring that, as Mr. Duncan talked about, that we have a streamlined process for LNG exports so that our natural gas can both get to where it needs to go domestically, but also internationally to displace global coal, which is one of the greatest single opportunities for large-scale emissions reductions in the short term. Permitting of Class 6 wells for CCUS here in the United States, infrastructure associated with the potential for hydrogen deployment in the future. The key to all of that is that permitting reform is the key to ensure that we're able to do that, especially in a way that American energy remains affordable, reliable as we continue to innovate and drive down emissions. So long delays from our, broken and outdated permitting system have made it quite difficult to build some of these needed infrastructure projects or deploy new innovations. And the threats from frivolous lawsuits on top of that really discourage investment and open up worthy projects to unnecessary risk. As we've talked about, we think there was a really important down payment made in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that was passed on a bipartisan basis, include meaningful reforms to NEPA and approval of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is going to provide low cost, clean natural gas to American families and businesses. But I think we can all agree that it should not take an act of Congress to approve a pipeline. So, we hope that this really just set the stage for more comprehensive permitting reform because there's a lot more that needs to be done. To build on that progress, we would look for things like litigation reform, additional reforms to NEPA, and reforms to the process of producing on federal land. So again, just want to thank Chrissy and the entire CREST team for convening this really important discussion. And with that, I'll yield back to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ann. We've heard from the renewables. We've heard from oil and gas. Let's turn to the electric utilities. Brian, I know that EEI and your member companies play a very important role in the clean energy expansion, and a lot of policymakers are rightly focused in your space. Would love to hear your insights on this area as well.
Well, Chrissy, thank you. And thanks, Cress. I really appreciate all of y'all's leadership, particularly over the last couple of weeks. It was great to see so many people in New York last week. I know that Jason would agree with me. This subject was front and center in that conversation when we talk about reducing emissions and what's going to actually take for us to get there. I was really glad to see that we had a congressional panel of speakers today as well. We just had Garrett Graves to our CEO meeting, and like Jason was saying, Garrett was saying some of the same things with regards to modernizing siting and permitting, but to also really think that, we're not going to get there unless it's bipartisan. It's just that clear that we all need to be rowing in the same direction. And you're going to see EEI be a lot more vocal this fall. I think we certainly have a period this fall with the calendar to have these conversations. We've certainly communicated the need for updating siting and permitting improvements, talking about efficiency, being environmentally sound, being clear, consistent, all the things that Ann just mentioned too, we think are really important. Look, I think that there's a couple of things that, I've got a number of notes here. You all know what was in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which we considered a sort of down payment, right? It was a small piece of legislation, but it was important to really get out there with regards to highlighting NEPA and really some of the shortcomings across the country that have been experienced because of NEPA and the work that needs to be done there. So I think that we did get a little bit of a down payment on some of those improvements. Like Jason, I want to talk about just a couple of things that we're going to be talking about this fall. And look, EEI, we have 78 member companies. We have 260 million customers across the country. We are customer centric, and we have to think about right now what our customers are currently experiencing, which we're in this place right now on the electric utility side of energy inflation. We've been in this period for about 12 months. We don't anticipate coming out of this period of energy inflation probably over the next 18 months more that we're going to have in this area. And I only mention that because I think that there's a lot that CEQ just announced with the revisions to NEPA that they were implementing. I think some of those programmatic reviews that they're doing and increased use of categorical exclusions is really important. I think the Department of Energy's work and also
I think we lost Brian. No, he's coming back soon, though. We look forward to, he was on a roll too. The nature of these virtual programs. Jennifer, let's turn it over to you while Brian comes back on. I know that there's a high number of exciting things happening in the
say to
nuclear
you
space.
all that the same, really. They're all very different. They're all very different in the way that they work. They're all really different with regards to interstate transmission and what's going on there. We are building transmission in this country. We're just not doing it at the level that really takes. Oops. Wait.
We totally agree, and we want to talk more further about transmission. Absolutely. Are you with us, Brian? There you are.
Let me see if I can do something about the video being frozen. Hold on one second.
That sounds good. Brian, while you figure that out, Jennifer, can we turn to you? I would love to get your insights on the nuclear energy industry and the issues it's currently facing in this space.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chrissy. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all here today about nuclear energy. This really could not be a more serious moment for the climate crisis or energy independence concerns. Demand for nuclear is surging really wherever you look. The federal government's recent actions are a testament to unprecedented level of support from leaders across the political spectrum for clean energy, including existing and next generation nuclear power. New laws provide powerful tax incentives that will preserve our existing nuclear generation which is the country's largest source of clean carbon-free generation. And these laws also will accelerate future deployment. This progress at the federal level is driving unprecedented action across the country and the entire economy, really, in state capitals, in small towns, in private investment portfolios, and public utility partnerships, and in communities with retiring coal plants. And also those communities that are looking to have hydrogen facilities. Individual states are paving their own paths to nuclear power. We've seen more than 200 nuclear-related bills under consideration just this year. So demand for nuclear is increasing around the world as well as just in the nation. And that's driven by energy security, because energy security is national security. Nations are waking up to the fact that they are more secure with nuclear in their energy portfolio, especially with the United States as their chosen partner. Support for nuclear energy is gaining as world leaders see geopolitical concerns that come from countries depending on energy sources from countries like Russia. Countries in Europe are breaking these ties and are seeking a trusted partner like the United States to bring more clean nuclear power online. When a nation pursues nuclear power, their choice of partner becomes a diplomatic statement. Nuclear development forges deep economic and diplomatic ties, and these relationships can last over 100 years. So the clean energy transition is going to take all of us together, but the world is safer when the United States is the standard bearer for nuclear energy. The combination of the international energy crisis and policy support here at home have created unprecedented levels of demand for nuclear. NEI, Nuclear Energy Institute, polled our chief nuclear officers from our member utilities, and they are expecting to add more than 100 gigawatts of nuclear power to the grid, the bulk of that coming online by 2050. That demand adds up to hundreds of new reactors over the coming years, which would double the U.S. nuclear energy output. And the Department of Energy predicts an even greater demand. According to their recent Pathways to Commercial Liftoff report, U.S. nuclear energy capacity has the potential to triple to around 300 gigawatts by 2050, all driven by advanced nuclear technologies. And around the world, our global allies are following our lead and are doubling down on the commitments to build and extend their nuclear fleets. The world needs clean energy, but that future faces hurdles. And we've all been seeing that for years, and now we're looking to do something about it. There's no question about whether demand for nuclear will last. The only question is how fast we can meet it. And right now, that depends on our regulatory process. The DOE estimates that starting in the early 2030s, we'll need to ramp up advanced nuclear deployment toward a rate of 13 gigawatts per year. That means a bow wave of siting permits, construction permits, and licensing applications in the coming years. These processes rely on approval through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And although the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has recently taken some steps to improve efficiency, a lot more improvement is needed. The NRC just isn't moving fast enough to meet the rising rate of demand for advanced reactors. To put timelines in some perspective, the Commission is currently anticipating anywhere from 18 to 22 months for simply renewing licenses for existing reactors. Meanwhile, it's taking 40,000 review hours and counting to approve early site permits. These delayed approvals drive excessive costs, which ultimately hinder deployment that is necessary to meet this demand. Our industry is really committed to overcoming these regulatory challenges and meeting this historic moment of demand. One of our main challenges revolves around siting. The U.S. regulatory process requires approval for sites of commercial nuclear reactors, which involves both an environmental and a safety assessment. But the process is just taking too long. Since 2007, the associated costs of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission reviews for site permits increased by a factor of 2 to 3. Working with our members, NEI has developed a report that identifies areas where the NRC can actually streamline its regulatory reviews and require less detail from applicants without sacrificing safety. So to meet the skyrocketing demand for nuclear, we need a modern, streamlined regulatory process that maintains the gold standard of safety while paving the way for new builds. There are already 15 designs from 13 advanced reactor developers in application or pre-application engagement with the NRC. If we're serious about decarbonization commitments, we can't let these opportunities decay in a pile of regulatory paperwork. Thankfully, both chambers of Congress recognize the need for both NRC and permitting and siting reform in general, because it's critical for the future of advanced nuclear deployment. With slim majorities in both chambers, we really must think about permitting and siting as a national bipartisan issue. The Senate is working across the aisle and on potential Nuclear Regulatory Commission reforms, like the overwhelmingly bipartisan ADVANCE Act, which was approved by the Senate. In the House, we are encouraged by efforts to reform NEPA and by recent bipartisan actions from the House Energy and Commerce Committee on NRC reform. The committee has held 3 bipartisan nuclear hearings that included a legislative hearing on 15 bills to reform and redirect the NRC and its processes. So the nation is going to rely on nuclear power in the future, and we need to make sure that we are able to get through the regulatory processes efficiently as well as effectively. So thank you.
That was fantastic, Jennifer. Thank you. A really dynamic time to be in the nuclear energy space. I would love to turn it over to Malcolm Wolf right now to discuss some of the issues that he is seeing right now in the hydropower energy, in the hydropower space.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. Happy to represent NHA, America's first renewable resource. Let me begin my brief comments, maybe being inspired by Jason's musical reference. I think I'm going to go with Taylor Swift. I think I've seen this film before and I didn't like the ending. We've been talking about license reform in the hydropower space for decades, and we haven't been able to get anything particularly meaningful through. So I'm hoping that this Congress, something's going to be different. I have reason for optimism. I think things are finally coming together because we really need reform now. Let me start with really 3 points. First, a 24/7 clean energy grid requires flexible carbon-free hydropower and pump storage. For those of you who aren't aware, there's currently about 80 gigawatts of hydropower on the grid. There's another 20 gigawatts, 22 gigawatts of flexible pump storage that makes hydropower the second largest source of renewable power on the grid, providing power to about 30 million Americans. Big fan of battery energy storage, other forms of technologies, but right now, 90+% of gross generation of even long duration energy storage is from pump storage. There was an NREL report that came out a week or 2 ago that said that this fleet, because it's dispatchable, can help balance variable renewables of 140 gigawatts. So if you want to have a clean energy grid as the grid keeps transitioning, we also want 24/7 reliability, and the dispatchability of hydropower and pump storage really make that happen. So to provide a real world example of what I'm talking about, I think it was last summer, a nuclear plant tripped offline in New England, and instantly Northfield Mountain and Bear Swamp Pump Storage jump into the fray. They provide 1,200 megawatts of pump storage immediately, and the lights in Boston don't even flicker. That kind of flexibility is what a dynamic clean energy grid is going to need, and that's why the dispatchability of pump storage and hydropower is so important. There's over 50 gigawatts of new pump storage using existing infrastructure or off-river sites that is currently seeking preliminary permits through FERC. If even a fraction of those were to get developed, it would be a game changer, but something's got to change to actually make that happen. So that gets me to my second point, which is that the current licensing and relicensing process really is driving the existing fleet to surrender their license prematurely and preventing new generation from coming online. There are 459 facilities that have licenses that expire in the next dozen years. 65 have already surrendered their license. At this point, those 65 are smaller facilities. I want to make sure that that ripple doesn't become a wave. There's 17 gigawatts of existing carbon-free dispatchable power that's at risk. On average, it takes 5 years to license a hydropower facility. If it's new, it takes over 8 years to relicense an existing facility, and many facilities that's over a decade or more. I heard Maria comment just a few minutes ago that at the NRC, it takes 18 to 24 months for relicensing. We would love that. We're facing 8 years or more. So why is that? I think there's three main barriers. First, there's a lack of process discipline. In the nuclear context, there's one agency that has responsibility. For hydropower, it's dozens of agencies at the federal and state level. No one's responsible for coordination or even having consequences. If a state agency fails to issue a Clean Water Act 401 permit for a decade, even though the law says not more than 1 year, there's no consequences. Just FERC can't issue a permit because the state hasn't done its job. So there's no process discipline. There's mission creep. Some of these agencies are requiring things that have nothing to do with the facility. They're just an opportunity to advance their own policy agenda. So whether it's building amphitheaters for the Boy Scouts or paying money to change how farmers upstream irrigate their crops, we were faced with mission creep, with agencies asking for things that really have nothing to do with the facility. And then finally, third barrier, there's a disconnect between these licensing timelines and financing realities. 5, 10 plus years just drives capital to other technologies, which is a challenge because we're not going to be able to have a grid that is exclusively wind and solar. We need the diversity of resources. Final point, good news, I hope, is that reform legislation is moving in both chambers. Chair Kathy McMorris-Rodgers held a hearing last week on her bill, the Hydropower Clean Energy Reform Act, HR 4045. And there's, at least judging from the comments at the hearing, there's bipartisan interest in moving that forward. At the same time, there's a bipartisan bill introduced by Senators Daines and Cantwell that's moving in the Senate, S-1521, the Community and Hydropower Improvement Act. That's been co-sponsored by a number of the folks on the committee, Senators Rich, Crapo, Wyden. This is a diverse range from across the aisle that are supporting this. I think it's because we've been able to build a broad coalition. I think there's a broad recognition with industry, environmental groups, tribal groups, that we can't have a grid without the reliability provided by pump storage and hydropower. And if we don't fix the system, these resources are going to go away. So we're working hard to get a bill onto President Biden's desk this Congress this year, either as a standalone bill or with whatever vehicle is moving, because these plants are facing retirement decisions right now. With that, I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Malcolm. Lots of really exciting things happening in the hydropower space. Thanks for that update. While Brian still troubleshoots his video, we'll come back to him, but let's engage in some questions. One thing that I find very striking about this group is how much of the energy sector is represented. It indicates, as Malcolm had just described, a broad coalition of support for permitting reform. But like many big things, it's easier to have top line support and the devil's in the details. In a way, this conversation on permitting reform is very similar to me to comprehensive tax reform talks in 2016 and 2017, for instance. Does this group find that industry, is it still in camps? Or do you think that there's an opportunity for a grand bargain or a large comprehensive package? Jason, you called for the need for a gang. I would love for you to lean into that Should the gang work on a comprehensive package? What does that look like?
So look, it has to be multifaceted and symmetrical. It is not going to solve any of our problems, but I think that if you look at every one of the Hollywood square boxes here, we each see a real opportunity to advance the industry and national interest in a kind of collaborative piece of legislation. And I again, I don't know if we're going to be able to get into it here, but I think we pretty much kind of know what we think would work. And I'm just going to say again, somebody's got to ask. We're going to defer to each other's expertise, right? We're the energy industry. And I think people don't appreciate how much interaction there is between all of our groups, right? 2/3 of all renewable power is being built right now by companies with fossil assets. Right? This is not kind of the old days of people in different camps, but we're still going to defer to Ann's expertise when it comes to what's necessary around Clean Water Act pipelines, and I'm sure she's going to look to what we think when it comes, along with Brian, to transmission stuff. So again, somebody's got to put us all in a room. Otherwise, if I call an emergency meeting of my board to talk about judicial reform, they're like, what the hell is this guy smoking? There's no rationale to have that kind of difficult conversation unless it's in the service of actually moving a legislative process forward.
There's just some great points. Malcolm, you're nodding. Do you agree?
I do agree. I think there is an opportunity in this Congress to get something done. And look no further than H.R. 1. I mean, there's a reason that the House Republicans made that the number one issue. I think while the details of that bill are controversial, I think there's also a lot of support for comprehensive reform on the Democratic side. But there has to be a deal. There has to be something for people to respond to. I think a lot of the issues that the other industries face, hydropower faces as well, we may be a little different as we've got the Federal Power Act, which many of the other agencies or technologies don't have. But directionally, we're all talking about the same thing. We're not talking about environmental rollbacks. We're not talking about cutting people out of the process. I think at this point, everyone's looking for singles and doubles. There may be a home run that we would all love. At this point, if we can get a few singles and doubles, we could seize the momentum from the Inflation Reduction Act, get those domestic jobs created, and make our grid more reliable now. And I hope that changes the political dynamic.
Taylor Swift references and now baseball references. Malcolm, you're a pro. Ann and Jennifer, any thoughts on what you think about a comprehensive package and the likelihood that Congress will be able to engage something by the end of the year?
I would just say I firmly agree. I like Jason's idea of a gang. I think this has to be, bipartisan, bicameral work that gets done. And I do think we kind of know the outlines of what it would look like. We all would benefit from NEPA reform. We all would benefit from litigation reform. And while we also have some more unique challenges, I think industry by industry. I look at my industry would also be supportive of transmission reform. I'm not in the weeds there, and that's not my issue, but I hear a lot about the need for oil field electrification, for example. And so, there's I think there's a lot more area of agreement than there is disagreement on this. And I think there's, that's why I'm, whether it's this year or next year, I'm quite bullish on these on this prospect, because I do think it's necessary. It touches every one of our industries, and sooner or later, I do think it will happen.
I think so. Brian, thank you for. We're delighted to see you come back, and right in the middle of your great point about transmission. Would love to turn it back over to you for some airtime and hear more about some of your priorities and thoughts in this space.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. We have an entire floor that's out, so we're having to do a little patchwork here. But Ann, thank you for your recommendation, by the way. So I want to go back to what Jason said, because I couldn't be more on board with. I think this needs a gang, and they need to be, given the credibility to go out and actually, to Jason's point, negotiate. I think that's really needed right now. I do agree with something that Malcolm said. I wouldn't throw out the possibility of, everything starts out large in Congress and then whittles down to the real focus. So something that Malcolm said is that I wouldn't also turn away from singles and doubles that could be done with regards to permitting and siting and transmission in particular. I was setting this up to say that we have real cost concern industry because our customers are facing this period of energy inflation, like I said. So I just want to be careful about how we approach it, knowing that those costs are going to be on their back. That they're the ones that pay for that transmission. So we have to think about it that way. And so I would offer two things like Jason did. One is really robust legislation around interregional planning. It's one thing to go out there and talk about a study. It's another thing to go out there and really do the technical work about what is actually needed. And something that Ann said earlier, we have to also think about our sector partners and other sectors like Ann's, because the broader electrification right now is expanding much faster than what we thought. Energy use itself, electricity use is up 73%. Right? So our systems have to be able to account for that. We need to do more with advanced transmission and the technologies that are currently out there and doing more with what we already have, while at the same time, like Malcolm said, is like focus on some of these singles and doubles, like a really robust interregional planning process in the legislation. And then another thing too is not all regions are the same in this country. Right? We have different regions for different purposes. It might be Energy Alley, in the South. It might be, we may be in the far West with a different set of energy needs. So I would just say when we look at that, I would only say that maybe the minimum transfer is something. When I look at the Scott Peters and Hickenlooper's legislation, it makes me think of not every region is the same. So maybe we need to think about a smaller minimum transfer that more people can support. And I think the cost allocation aspects of transmission, Jason knows how complicated those are, but I definitely think that, look, we're going to be at the table this fall. We're going to be very vocal this fall on this. We view this as a last opportunity to get something done and to really take advantage of the investments in the bipartisan leadership, the infrastructure package, and also the IRA as well. We had $272 billion worth of customer tax credits. We need to be able to, with our clean energy partners, take advantage of those tax cuts and build. And, we need to get back to building things in this country, not just in other sectors where the legislation calls for, but we need to do it right here with transmission as well.
Well, Brian, I'm really glad that you brought up the importance of affordability in addition to reliability. I think that's certainly important. I want to pick up on another concept that you just discussed, which is the role of states. I know that here, where most of us, I think, are based in DC. We all work really closely with federal lawmakers and federal agencies, but we know that there are a lot of state and local regulations that are important in this space. And I recall that this was a key theme that came out of some of the panel discussions that we had yesterday as well. Just curious to know if this group has insights on, what the role of the states are and in this process, and whether there are barriers or opportunities that we can do in working with state and local lawmakers and helping getting projects in the ground.
Some of my best friends live in states, and there's absolutely no question that states play a fundamental, and in most cases, like the fundamental role in the initiation of the expansion of energy infrastructure. And we developed a system of expectations and rules and norms about 100 years ago when we had something called the local power company. And so the reality today, obviously, is that model is just different than what modernity looks like in power generation. It's different than what modernity looks like in terms of regional economies. And so we have to figure out, and this is what I was suggesting in terms of how you kind of honor a modern vision of federalism, we've got to figure out how to make sure that states have that fundamental kind of police power that is vested in the Constitution, and that every state doesn't have a veto on the national interest. And we see that in pipelines, and we see that like linear infrastructure is tough. And so I think you saw Congress 15 years ago, more than 15 years ago, in the 2005 Energy Policy Act say, hey, you know what? There are some critical national interests where if the states are not moving in an efficient way, the federal government has an obligation to the country to step in, that kind of backstop authority idea. To date, it has worked exactly never because it was defined poorly and FERC didn't have the right kind of so there's something to do. We are going to have to reimagine a little bit of that federal state relationship. Last thing I will note is that while states very, very aggressively kind of guard all of their prerogative, the states that are actually trying to move forward quickly with clean energy are preempting a lot of their local counties. If you look at what Illinois and New York and California are doing, right, they're suffering this same challenge, which is they can't even make decisions that are relevant to the long-term interest of their states because you can have a small community objecting. So long way of saying, you know, we obviously have to be working first and foremost through the states, but we cannot have a small minority of opinion undermine the national shared interest.
I think that is a fantastic.
I'll jump in on that point
please.
If I could as well.
Please.
There's a phrase I like, progress moves at the speed of trust. And I think that trust is broken down in this process. I know in the hydropower world, states have a critical role to play in the licensing permitting process, but they've got to meet their statutory obligations. And we routinely have states fail to meet their statutory deadlines, supposed to do it in a year. Sometimes it takes 10 years. Sometimes we are invited to the process at the beginning of the process, and they say, no, we don't want to participate to preserve our ability to litigate later. We've got to do multi-year seasonal studies of fish. If they want this particular species, tell us at the beginning so we can do all the studies simultaneously. Don't wait 3 years and then come in. And so there's an element of trust here. I think we've got to change the mindset so that, hey, we're addressing a national challenge, and we need the states as partners, and they're really going to step up and fund their agencies, give them the resources needed so they can actually be good partners.
But do you find that is true from your perspective, Jennifer, in the nuclear?
Yeah, I was just about to jump in. Sorry about that, Chrissy. So in states play an important role in permitting in the nuclear energy industry as well. And we are seeing this overwhelming support for nuclear energy by the states. I mentioned just this year, there were over 200 bills that were proposed associated with various aspects of nuclear energy. And this, we need to do things more smoothly in federally, but also at the state level. 100% agree. We also need to make sure that we are reaching out to these communities that are going to be impacted, so we can hear their views and we can disposition them respectfully. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that the states play a critical role here. And perhaps there needs to be more dialogue to get this trust built back up, so that through the trust, we'll be able to streamline some of not only the federal, but the state requirements as well.
And if I could just jump in, and I want to shout out to Jason for mentioning pipelines in his remarks, but I think the greatest example of this is the fact that we have the largest and one of the cleanest natural gas fields in the world in the Pennsylvania area that cannot transport that clean American-made natural gas up to the Northeast because one state does not want to build a new pipeline going across it. And so states like Maine and other places in New England are importing Russian or other natural gas or burning heating fuel. And so it's just, that is a perfect illustration of where, we really need to think about what is the role of states when you're looking at, especially some small states crowded together where you're really relying on each other. And is there a national interest question here that should maybe also come into play? So I just think that to me is a perfect example of kind of what Jason was alluding to and to your question.
It's a perfect example, and it's a perfect note to end on. And I regret we're out of time. Thank you to ACP, AXPC, EEI, NEI, and NHA for being so generous with your time and insights. And I do encourage our panelists to, our audience to reach out to our panelists or myself if you have any questions left unanswered. And we look forward to continuing our conversation throughout our National Clean Energy Week programming. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.